Lady Catherine Pemberton adjusted her white gloves one final time before entering the dining room at Windsor Castle. As the newly appointed protocol officer to the royal household, she carried the weight of centuries-old traditions on her shoulders. The mahogany doors opened to reveal a scene that would have taken any outsider's breath away, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over gleaming silver, pristine white linen stretched across tables that had witnessed the conversations of kings and queens for generations. But Catherine saw something entirely different. She saw a battlefield where wars were fought with salad forks and surrenders were signaled with the placement of a wineglass. Every element in this room spoke a language that few outside the palace walls could understand, a secret code that had been passed down through generations of royal staff members like herself. The morning briefing had been particularly intense. Queen Elizabeth's private secretary had pulled Catherine aside with urgent instructions about the upcoming state dinner for the Japanese delegation. "Remember," the secretary had whispered, "the placement of the bread plate will determine the entire flow of tomorrow's trade negotiations. One misplaced setting could cost the kingdom millions." Catherine had nodded solemnly, though part of her still marveled at how such seemingly simple objects could carry such enormous weight. She had spent months studying under her predecessor, Mrs. Margaret Thornberry, a woman who had dedicated 43 years of her life to understanding the intricate dance of royal dining protocol. Mrs. Thornberry had a saying that Catherine would never forget: "In this household, dear, a fork is never just a fork. It's a conversation, a declaration, sometimes even a weapon." The education had been exhaustive. Catherine learned that when the Queen placed her handbag on the table, it meant she wished to end the conversation within 5 minutes. When she placed it on the floor, the evening was over entirely. The positioning of her cutlery could signal to staff whether she was enjoying the meal, whether she wished to speak privately with a particular guest, or whether someone had committed a breach of etiquette so severe that diplomatic consequences might follow. These signals weren't arbitrary rules created by stuffy courtiers with too much time on their hands. They were practical solutions developed over centuries of royal dining, where direct communication might create international incidents. When King George VI needed to signal his displeasure with a visiting ambassador's inappropriate comments about British foreign policy, he couldn't simply tell the man to stop talking. Instead, he moved his water glass to the left side of his plate, a signal that meant the topic was closed and any further discussion would be considered hostile. Catherine walked slowly around the table, checking each place setting with the precision of a surgeon. The fish fork needed to be exactly 3/4 of an inch from the salad fork. The water glass positioned at a 45-degree angle from the bread plate. These measurements weren't suggestions, they were requirements that had been encoded in royal protocol documents dating back to Queen Victoria's reign. She paused at the head of the table, where the Queen's place setting waited. Even in the monarch's absence, the setting commanded respect. The gold-rimmed plate bore the royal coat of arms, and, surrounding it, an array of cutlery that told the story of the evening ahead. Each piece had been selected not just for its function, but for its message. The presence of the fish knife indicated that the meal would include a formal fish course, signaling to knowledgeable guests that this was a dinner of the highest importance. The positioning of the dessert spoon above the plate meant that the evening would conclude with a traditional British pudding, a subtle reminder of the kingdom's culinary heritage. Even the choice of glasses sent messages. Crystal stemware from the royal collection indicated that the finest wines would be served, while the smaller port glasses suggested that the gentlemen would be invited to remain for cigars and private conversation after the ladies withdrew. Catherine's phone buzzed with a text from the kitchen. The head chef needed confirmation about the sauce for the main course. This wasn't simply a culinary question, it was a diplomatic one. The choice between a traditional British sauce and a lighter European preparation would signal to the guests how closely the kingdom aligned itself with continental Europe versus maintaining its traditional independence. She quickly typed back her recommendation for the traditional preparation. Tonight's dinner was for the American Secretary of State, and recent tensions over trade agreements meant that emphasizing British tradition would send the right message about the kingdom's negotiating position. Walking back toward the kitchen to coordinate with the staff, Catherine reflected on how few people understood the true complexity of royal dining. Tourists who glimpsed these rooms during public tours saw beauty and grandeur. They marveled at the gold leaf decorations and gasped at the priceless artwork adorning the walls. But they missed entirely the sophisticated communication system that operated right before their eyes. The kitchen buzzed with controlled activity. Chef Morrison, a compact man whose culinary skills had earned him recognition from 3 monarchs, looked up from the sauce he was preparing. "The Americans will expect larger portions than our usual guests," he said without preamble. "But we can't appear to be catering too obviously to their preferences. Catherine nodded. This was another aspect of the hidden language: portion sizes, cooking methods, even the temperature of the food conveyed meaning. Serving food that was too hot suggested impatience and disrespect for the guest's schedule. Food that was too cold implied a lack of proper preparation and attention to detail. The perfect temperature required timing so precise that it bordered on the miraculous. What about the wine selection? Chef Morrison continued. The cellar master suggests the 1982 Bordeaux, but that might be interpreted as too obvious a compliment. Catherine considered this carefully. Wine selection was perhaps the most delicate aspect of royal dining protocol. The choice of vintage, region, and even the manner of serving could make or break diplomatic relationships. A French wine might please the guest but could be seen as a slight to British wine producers. A British wine might demonstrate patriotism but could be interpreted as insulting to the guest's sophisticated palate. Let's go with the Bordeaux for the main course, she decided. But we'll start with a British sparkling wine to establish our position clearly from the beginning. The afternoon brought a flurry of final preparations. Catherine supervised as the junior staff members polished each piece of silverware until it gleamed. She watched as the florists arranged the centerpieces, making sure that no flowers blocked the sightlines between guests, another crucial element of royal dining protocol. Conversations needed to flow freely across the table, and any obstruction could be interpreted as a deliberate slight. Mrs. Thornberry arrived at 4 o'clock for her final consultation. Despite her retirement, she still commanded enormous respect among the palace staff. Her knowledge of royal dining protocol was legendary, and Catherine had specifically requested her presence for tonight's important dinner. The napkin placement concerns me, Mrs. Thornberry said after examining the table settings. For American guests, we want to signal formality but not stuffiness. The current fold is too elaborate, it suggests we're trying too hard to impress. Catherine watched as the older woman demonstrated the proper fold, elegant but understated, conveying confidence rather than anxiety about the impression being made. These subtle distinctions were what separated true protocol experts from mere rule followers. Remember, Mrs. Thornberry continued, every choice we make tonight will be analyzed by protocol experts in Washington. They'll be looking for signals about how seriously we take this relationship, how much respect we have for their representative, and what our expectations are for future negotiations. The weight of responsibility settled more heavily on Catherine's shoulders. She had always known that royal protocol was important, but working directly with these high-stakes dinners had taught her that international relationships could literally hang on the placement of a soup spoon. As 5 o'clock approached, Catherine made her final rounds. The table gleamed under the chandelier light, every surface reflecting the careful attention that had been paid to each detail. The place cards had been calligraphed by hand, using traditional British spelling and formal titles. Even the spacing between chairs had been measured to ensure that guests would be comfortable but not so distant that conversation became difficult. She paused at the window, looking out at the gardens where previous generations of royals had entertained heads of state and world leaders. How many crucial decisions had been influenced by the careful choreography of royal dining? How many wars had been prevented or started based on whether a guest felt properly honored by the meal they were served? The head butler appeared at her elbow with the final guest list. 7 attendees plus the Queen, a number carefully chosen to encourage intimate conversation while maintaining the formal structure required for a state dinner. Catherine reviewed the seating arrangement one last time, confirming that each guest would be positioned to maximize both protocol requirements and conversational opportunities. At precisely 6:30, the first guests would arrive for cocktails in the drawing room. At 7:15, they would be escorted to the dining room for the meal itself. Every minute had been planned, every transition carefully choreographed to maintain the rhythm and flow that would put the guests at ease while reinforcing the dignity and importance of the occasion. Catherine checked her watch. 1 hour remaining until the evening began. In 60 minutes, this carefully prepared stage would come alive with the performance of royal dining, a performance where every gesture mattered, every word carried weight, and every detail contributed to the ongoing story of Britain's relationship with the world. She took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders as she prepared for the evening ahead. Tonight, she would serve not just as a protocol officer, but as a guardian of traditions that had shaped the course of history itself. The American Secretary of State, Robert Harrison, stood in his hotel suite adjusting his tie for the third time in 5 minutes. His aide, Jennifer Walsh, watched with growing concern as her normally confident boss displayed unusual nervousness about the evening ahead. "Sir, you've dined with heads of state around the world," Jennifer reminded him gently.
"This shouldn't be any different."
Harrison paused, meeting her eyes in the mirror.
"That's where you're wrong, Jennifer.
Every other dinner I've attended has been about politics, economics, or military strategy.
Tonight is about something far more complex. It's about proving that we understand and respect traditions that go back centuries."
Jennifer had done her homework on British royal protocol, but she was beginning to realize that her research might not have prepared her for the reality they were about to face. The briefing documents from the State Department had mentioned basic etiquette rules: don't turn your back on the Queen, wait for her to start eating before beginning your own meal, address her as Your Majesty initially and Ma'am thereafter. But Harrison's anxiety suggested there were layers of complexity that the briefing papers hadn't covered. "Tell me again about the silverware," Harrison said, turning away from the mirror to face his aide directly.
Jennifer consulted her notes. "Work from the outside in with each course.
Don't hold your knife like a pencil, keep your index finger along the top of the handle. And never, ever cut your salad with a knife.
What about the napkin?
Place it on your lap immediately after sitting down, but don't unfold it completely. When you need to excuse yourself temporarily, place it on your chair.
When the meal is finished, place it loosely to the right of your plate, never fold it."
Harrison nodded, but his expression remained troubled.
"You know what worries me most? It's not the rules themselves. I can memorize rules.
It's the fact that there are probably dozens of signals and meanings that we don't even know exist.
We could unknowingly insult the crown without ever realizing what we've done." This concern was more justified than either of them realized.
Across London, in a small office near Westminster, Professor David Chamberlain was putting the finishing touches on his latest academic paper about the semiotics of royal dining. Professor Chamberlain had spent 15 years studying the hidden meanings embedded in British royal protocol, and his research had uncovered a communication system far more sophisticated than most people imagined. "The Americans will be at a significant disadvantage tonight," he explained to his research assistant, Sarah Mills, as they reviewed video footage from previous state dinners.
"They're entering a conversation where they don't speak the language."
On the screen, they watched footage from a dinner 3 years earlier where the German Chancellor had unknowingly committed several protocol breaches that had taken months of diplomatic effort to smooth over. The Chancellor had reached across the table for the salt rather than asking for it to be passed, a gesture that in royal dining contexts suggested impatience and disregard for proper procedure. Worse, she had begun eating before the Queen had taken her first bite, a breach so serious that the British press had discussed it for weeks afterward. "Look at this moment," Professor Chamberlain said, pausing the video as the camera captured the Queen's reaction.
"See how she adjusts her water glass?
That's a signal to the staff that the guest's behavior is being noted for the official record."
Sarah studied the screen carefully. "But surely these things are just accidents. No one would deliberately insult the Queen over dinner protocol."
"That's exactly the point," Professor Chamberlain replied. "The system is designed so that breaches appear to be accidents, allowing everyone to maintain dignity while still communicating displeasure or disapproval.
It's a remarkably sophisticated way to conduct diplomacy." Back at Windsor Castle, Catherine was conducting a final briefing with the serving staff.
23 men and women stood at attention in the servants' hall, each one responsible for a specific aspect of the evening's service. They ranged from experienced veterans like Thomas Hartwell, who had served at royal dinners for 37 years, to newer staff members like Maria Santos, who had joined the royal household only 6 months earlier. "Tonight is particularly important," Catherine began, "because our guests may not fully understand the significance of their actions during the meal. We need to be especially attentive to any situations that might require diplomatic interpretation."
Thomas Hartwell raised his hand.
"What if they use the wrong fork for a particular course?
Do we correct them discreetly, or do we allow the breach to stand?" This was exactly the kind of question that kept Catherine awake at night.
Correcting a guest's mistake might prevent a diplomatic incident, but it could also be seen as condescending or insulting.
Allowing the mistake to continue might be interpreted as the British staff being too polite to provide proper guidance.
"Use your judgment," Catherine decided. "If the error is minor and doesn't affect the overall flow of the meal, let it pass. If it's something that will be noticed by other guests or captured by photographers, find a way to guide them gently toward the correct approach." Maria Santos looked nervous as she asked her question.
"What if they try to engage us in conversation during the meal?
I know we're supposed to be invisible, but what if they ask us direct questions?"
Catherine had anticipated this concern. American guests often had a more casual relationship with service staff than was traditional in British royal settings. Keep your responses brief and professional. Don't engage in extended conversation, but don't be rude. Remember that everything you say will be noted and, potentially, reported.
The briefing continued for another 20 minutes, covering everything from the proper way to serve wine, always from the right side of the guest, to how to handle requests for items that weren't part of the plan menu. Each detail mattered because each detail would be observed not just by the guests, but by protocol experts from both countries who would analyze every aspect of the evening for clues about the current state of Anglo-American relations. At the American Embassy, cultural attaché Michael Brennan was having his own concerns about the evening ahead. Brennan had lived in London for 8 years and had developed a deep appreciation for British customs and traditions. He understood better than most Americans how easy it was to give unintended offense through ignorance of local protocol. The secretary needs to understand, he explained to his assistant over the phone, that this isn't just about being polite. Every gesture tonight will be interpreted as a statement about America's respect for British institutions and traditions. If we appear dismissive or ignorant of their customs, it could affect trade negotiations for months to come. Brennan had attended enough British formal dinners to know that the rules extended far beyond basic table manners. The topics of conversation were carefully regulated, certain subjects were considered appropriate for different courses, while others were forbidden entirely. Personal questions about the royal family were absolutely prohibited. Political discussions were expected to remain general rather than specific. Even compliments had to be offered in the right way at the right time to avoid appearing insincere or calculated. Meanwhile, in the royal kitchens, Chef Morrison was putting the finishing touches on what would be the most scrutinized meal he had prepared in months. Every dish had been selected not just for its flavor, but for its symbolic significance. The starter featured Scottish salmon, emphasizing the unity of the United Kingdom. The main course showcased Welsh lamb with Yorkshire pudding, continuing the theme of British regional pride. Even the dessert carried meaning. Morrison had chosen a traditional spotted dick with custard, a deliberately humble choice that communicated confidence and comfort with British traditions rather than any attempt to impress with elaborate continental preparations. The message was clear: Britain was proud of its heritage and felt no need to apologize for or disguise its cultural identity. The wine selection had been finalized after consultation with experts from both the Foreign Office and the Palace. The British sparkling wine for the reception would demonstrate support for domestic producers. The Bordeaux for the main course acknowledged France as a respected neighbor and trading partner. The port for the end of the meal would return to British territory, offering guests a taste of a wine style that Britain had perfected over centuries. As 7 o'clock approached, Catherine made her way to the entrance hall where she would greet the American delegation upon their arrival. The Queen was already positioned in the drawing room, having spent 30 minutes reviewing briefing materials about each guest who would be joining her for dinner. These briefings covered not just professional accomplishments and political positions, but personal details that would allow Her Majesty to engage each guest in comfortable conversation: family members, hobbies, recent travels, anything that might provide common ground for discussion. The first car pulled up to the castle entrance at exactly 7:15. Secretary Harrison emerged, followed by his wife Margaret and the other members of their delegation. Catherine watched through the window as they paused for a moment, clearly impressed by the grandeur of their surroundings. She could see Harrison's wife adjusting her jewelry nervously, while the secretary himself took a deep breath before approaching the entrance. Catherine moved to the door to greet them personally. "Good evening, Mr. Secretary, Mrs. Harrison. Welcome to Windsor Castle. Her Majesty is looking forward to meeting with you this evening." The formal tone was deliberate, warm enough to be welcoming, but structured enough to establish the appropriate level of ceremony for the occasion. As she escorted them toward the drawing room, Catherine could see them taking in every detail of their surroundings, clearly aware that they were entering a world governed by rules and traditions unlike anything in their normal experience. The drawing room doors opened to reveal the Queen, resplendent in a midnight blue evening gown with diamond jewelry that had belonged to Queen Victoria. She stood beside the fireplace, her posture perfectly composed, her expression pleasant but dignified. This was the moment when the evening would truly begin, when American diplomacy would meet British royal tradition in a dance of courtesy and protocol that would set the tone for everything that followed. The introduction ceremony unfolded with choreographed precision that would have impressed even the most demanding theater director. Secretary Harrison approached the Queen with measured steps, his wife Margaret following exactly 3 paces behind, a positioning that had been carefully explained during their pre-arrival briefing. The Queen extended her gloved hand for the traditional greeting, and Catherine noticed with relief that Harrison performed the gesture correctly, neither too formal nor too casual. "Your Majesty," Harrison said with a respectful nod of his head, "it's an honor to meet you. Thank you for receiving us at Windsor this evening." "Mr. Secretary," the Queen replied with a gracious smile, "the pleasure is entirely mine." "I trust your journey from London was comfortable?" Catherine observed this exchange with professional interest. The Queen's choice to ask about the journey rather than launching immediately into substantive conversation was a classic opening gambit, polite enough to put guests at ease, but neutral enough to avoid any potentially contentious topics before dinner had even begun. It also gave her an opportunity to assess the Secretary's communication style and comfort level with formal protocol. "Very comfortable, thank you," Harrison replied. The countryside was beautiful even in the evening light. "I can understand why the royal family has chosen this location for so many centuries." Catherine noted with approval that Harrison had included a compliment about the castle's history, demonstrating both respect for tradition and awareness of the significance of his surroundings. This was exactly the kind of cultural sensitivity that would be noted and appreciated. The Queen turned to Margaret Harrison with practiced warmth. "Mrs. Harrison, I believe this is your first visit to Windsor Castle?" "Yes, Your Majesty, it is," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the obvious nervousness Catherine could detect in her posture. "It's absolutely magnificent. The photographs simply don't do justice to the reality." This response pleased the Queen visibly. Sincere appreciation for the castle's beauty was always well received, particularly when it acknowledged that the visitor had done some research beforehand. Catherine made a mental note that Mrs. Harrison would likely be seated in a position of honor during dinner. The cocktail reception continued for exactly 45 minutes, a duration calculated to allow sufficient time for introductions and light conversation without extending so long that guests became tired or conversation grew stale. Catherine watched as the Queen moved gracefully between her guests, spending precisely the right amount of time with each person to make them feel valued without neglecting the others. During this period, Catherine noticed several small but significant moments that demonstrated the sophisticated nature of royal communication. When the Queen placed her cocktail glass on a side table rather than holding it, this signaled to the staff that dinner service should begin within 10 minutes. When she moved from the center of the room toward the windows, guests understood that they should begin moving in the same direction, preparing for the transition to the dining room. At 8 o'clock precisely, the dinner bell chimed, a crystal tone that had called royalty to dinner for over 2 centuries. The Queen turned to Secretary Harrison and said, "Shall we proceed to dinner?" This wasn't really a question, but rather a polite way of announcing that the formal meal was about to begin. The procession to the dining room followed established protocol with military precision. The Queen led the way, escorted by Secretary Harrison. Mrs. Harrison followed on the arm of the Duke of Cambridge, while the remaining guests paired off according to a seating arrangement that had been planned weeks in advance and approved at the highest levels of both governments. As they entered the dining room, Catherine could hear the quiet gasps of appreciation from the American delegation. The table setting she had spent hours perfecting gleamed under the chandelier light like a jeweler's display. Every surface reflected the warm glow of candles, while crystal glasses caught and scattered light in tiny rainbows across the white linen. But Catherine knew that the real show was just beginning. The placement of guests around the table told its own story about the current state of Anglo-American relations. Secretary Harrison was seated to the Queen's right, the position of highest honor. His wife was placed to the left of the Duke of Cambridge, indicating respect for her status as the Secretary's spouse while maintaining appropriate protocol hierarchy. The Queen took her seat first, a signal that allowed all other guests to sit simultaneously. Catherine watched as the Americans navigated their place settings with varying degrees of confidence. Secretary Harrison seemed comfortable with the array of silverware before him, but she noticed Mrs. Harrison glancing uncertainly at the multiple forks and glasses surrounding her plate. The first course arrived with silent efficiency, the Scottish salmon prepared with traditional accompaniments of capers and dill. Catherine observed carefully as each guest approached this opening challenge of the meal. The salmon required delicate handling, and the way it was eaten would signal each diner's level of sophistication with formal dining. Secretary Harrison performed admirably, using his fish knife and fork with the proper technique, cutting small bites and eating them methodically without rushing. His wife followed his example, though Catherine could see her concentrating carefully on each movement. The other American guests managed the course with varying degrees of grace, but none committed any serious breaches of etiquette. During the salmon course, conversation remained light and general. The Queen inquired about American agricultural policies, a topic that allowed Secretary Harrison to display his knowledge while avoiding potentially controversial areas like defense spending or international trade disputes. This choice of topic was deliberate. Agriculture was an area where Britain and America could find common ground without triggering any political sensitivities. "I understand that American farmers have been experimenting with new sustainable farming techniques," the Queen observed as she delicately separated a flake of salmon from her fork. "Yes, Your Majesty," Harrison replied, clearly pleased to discuss a subject where he could highlight American innovation without appearing boastful. "We've seen remarkable progress in soil conservation and water management. I believe some of these techniques might be applicable to British farming as well." Catherine noted with approval how Harrison had turned his response toward potential collaboration rather than simply promoting American achievements. This kind of diplomatic language was exactly what the Queen appreciated: informative without being competitive, confident without being arrogant. The conversation during the first course established the tone for the remainder of the meal. Topics flowed naturally from agriculture to rural development, then to environmental conservation, all subjects where both countries could find shared interests and mutual respect. The Queen demonstrated her remarkable ability to guide conversation in directions that would be comfortable for her guests while still allowing substantial discussion of important issues. As the first course plates were cleared with silent precision, Catherine noticed the Queen make a subtle gesture with her water glass, rotating it clockwise by approximately 45 degrees. This signal indicated to the serving staff that the evening was proceeding successfully and that they should maintain the current pace of service. A counterclockwise rotation would have meant that the courses should be served more quickly to accommodate restless or uncomfortable guests. The main course presentation created another moment of diplomatic theater. Welsh lamb arrived accompanied by traditional Yorkshire pudding, roasted root vegetables, and a rich gravy that had been prepared according to recipes dating back to the Victorian era. The symbolic message was unmistakable: this was British cuisine at its finest, prepared with pride and served without apology for its hearty, traditional character. Secretary Harrison's response to the main course would be closely observed by everyone present. His reaction would indicate not just his personal taste preferences, but his administration's attitude toward British culture and traditions more broadly. Catherine watched as he took his first bite, chewed thoughtfully, and then smiled with genuine appreciation. "This is exceptional," he said to the Queen. "The flavor of the lamb is remarkable. I can taste the countryside where it was raised." This comment demonstrated exactly the kind of cultural sensitivity that the royal household appreciated. Rather than making generic compliments about the food's preparation, Harrison had acknowledged the connection between the meal and the British landscape that had produced it. This showed understanding of the relationship between British cuisine and British geography, culture, and agricultural heritage. The Queen's response was warm and immediate. "I'm delighted you appreciate it. This particular lamb comes from Welsh farms that have been raising sheep for over 4 centuries. The methods they use today aren't very different from those their ancestors employed." This exchange illustrated one of the most important functions of royal dining: the creation of personal connections between political leaders. Through discussing food, agriculture, and tradition, the Queen and Secretary Harrison were building a foundation of mutual respect that would influence their professional relationship for years to come. During the main course, conversation expanded to include more substantive political topics, but always within the safe boundaries established during the earlier courses. The Queen inquired about American perspectives on climate change initiatives, allowing Harrison to outline his government's policies while demonstrating American commitment to environmental protection. Catherine noticed how skillfully the Queen managed the conversation's rhythm and direction. When one topic seemed to be approaching controversial territory, she would smoothly transition to related but safer ground. When guests seemed particularly engaged with a subject, she would ask follow-up questions that allowed them to elaborate without dominating the conversation. The wine service during the main course provided another opportunity for diplomatic communication. The Bordeaux had been chosen specifically to honor the American guests while acknowledging France as a mutual ally of both countries. When the wine steward offered the bottle for Secretary Harrison's approval, his enthusiastic acceptance sent a clear message about America's respect for European culture and traditions. As the main course concluded, Catherine prepared for what she knew would be the most challenging portion of the evening: the dessert course and the traditional post-dinner conversations that would follow. This was when guards would be lowered, when casual comments might reveal true attitudes and intentions, and when the real diplomatic work of the evening would begin in earnest. The spotted dick arrived with great ceremony, accompanied by thick custard that had been prepared according to a recipe that the royal kitchens had been perfecting for decades.
Catherine watched with barely concealed amusement as the American guests encountered this quintessentially British dessert for the first time.
Their expressions ranged from polite curiosity to barely disguised uncertainty about what they were being served. Secretary Harrison approached the dessert with diplomatic courage, taking a generous portion and adding custard with the same confidence he had shown throughout the meal. His first bite was taken under the watchful eyes of everyone at the table, and Catherine could see him processing not just the flavors, but the cultural significance of what he was experiencing.
"This is delightful," Harrison said after a moment of consideration.
"The texture is much lighter than I expected, and the dried fruit adds a wonderful complexity."
The Queen's pleasure at this response was immediately evident.
"Spotted dick is often misunderstood by those who encounter it for the first time," she replied with a slight smile. "Many people expect it to be heavy or overly sweet, but, when prepared properly, it's quite refined." This exchange represented a perfect example of how royal dining could transform potential cultural barriers into opportunities for connection. By embracing a dessert that many foreigners found either amusing or off-putting, Secretary Harrison had demonstrated both adventurous spirit and respect for British culinary traditions. His thoughtful response showed that he understood the significance of the gesture. Mrs. Harrison followed her husband's lead, though Catherine could see that she was more cautious in her approach to the unfamiliar dessert. Her polite compliments about the custard's richness were sincere enough to satisfy protocol requirements, even if her enthusiasm didn't match her husband's more wholehearted embrace of the experience.
During the dessert course, conversation took on a more personal tone that would have been inappropriate earlier in the meal.
The Queen shared anecdotes about previous state visits, including a memorable dinner where the President of France had mistaken spotted dick for a savory course and had tried to eat it with the wrong cutlery. This story served multiple diplomatic purposes. It entertained the guests, demonstrated the Queen's ability to find humor in protocol mishaps, and subtly reassured the Americans that even experienced international leaders sometimes struggled with British dining customs. The poor man was too polite to ask for clarification, the Queen continued with evident amusement.
He simply proceeded as if sweet custard on a meat course was perfectly normal.
It wasn't until the actual meat arrived that he realized his mistake. Secretary Harrison laughed genuinely at this story, and Catherine noted how the anecdote had successfully shifted the evening's tone from formal diplomacy to friendly conversation. This transition was crucial because it allowed for the kind of personal connection that would make future professional interactions more productive and collaborative. As the dessert plates were cleared, Catherine prepared for the evening's final protocol challenge, the traditional separation of men and women for port and cigars. This custom, which dated back centuries, had been modified in recent decades to accommodate changing social expectations, but it remained an important part of formal royal dining. The Queen rose from her seat, a signal that indicated the formal dinner portion of the evening was concluding.
"Ladies," she said with graceful authority, "shall we retire to the drawing room for coffee?"
"Gentlemen, I believe the Duke has arranged for port in the library."
This moment required careful navigation by all the guests.
The American delegation needed to understand that the separation wasn't meant to be discriminatory, but rather represented a traditional opportunity for different types of conversation to occur simultaneously. The women would discuss cultural and social topics while the men engaged in more direct political and economic discussions.
Mrs. Harrison rose immediately, understanding intuitively that the Queen's invitation wasn't really optional.
The other American women followed her example, though Catherine could see some uncertainty in their expressions about what would be expected of them during this portion of the evening. As the ladies withdrew to the drawing room, Catherine accompanied them to ensure that proper protocol was maintained. The Queen led this group with the same grace she had shown throughout dinner, settling into a comfortable chair and gesturing for her guests to arrange themselves nearby.
The conversation in the drawing room focused on cultural exchanges between Britain and America. Mrs.
Harrison spoke knowledgeably about American art collections that included significant British works, while the Queen shared her experiences visiting American museums during previous state visits. This discussion served important diplomatic purposes while remaining safely removed from potentially controversial political topics. Meanwhile, in the library, Secretary Harrison found himself in the center of more substantive political discussions. The Duke poured port from crystal decanters that had been used for similar conversations with American officials dating back to the 1940s. The rich, sweet wine created an atmosphere of relaxed formality that encouraged frank discussion of international issues.
"Your president's approach to European trade relations has been quite interesting," the Duke observed as he handed Harrison a glass of vintage port. "We're curious about how this might affect our bilateral agreements going forward."
This was the moment Harrison had been preparing for throughout the evening. The careful courtesies of dinner had established mutual respect and goodwill, creating the foundation for more direct diplomatic conversation. His response would need to balance honesty about American intentions with reassurance about the continued importance of the Anglo-American relationship. "We remain committed to our relationship with Britain as our closest ally," Harrison replied carefully. "While we're certainly reviewing all our international agreements to ensure they serve American interests, we have no intention of undermining partnerships that have been beneficial to both our countries." Back in the drawing room, Catherine observed as the Queen skillfully gathered intelligence about American domestic politics through seemingly casual conversation about social issues and cultural trends. This information would later be included in briefing documents that would help shape British diplomatic strategy for months to come. The evening's most delicate moment came when Mrs. Harrison asked the Queen about her personal experiences with American visitors over the decades. This question required a response that would be diplomatic while still being sufficiently personal to satisfy curiosity about the monarch's private thoughts and feelings. "Americans have always brought a wonderful energy to these occasions," the Queen replied thoughtfully. "There's a directness and enthusiasm in American conversation that I find quite refreshing after the sometimes overly careful discussions we have with our European neighbors." This response was perfectly calibrated. It complemented American character traits while subtly distinguishing America from other international partners. The implied contrast with European diplomatic styles sent a clear message about Britain's appreciation for American straightforwardness and practical approach to problem solving. As 10 o'clock approached, both groups began to show signs that the evening was nearing its natural conclusion. The Queen had mastered the art of ending social occasions at exactly the right moment, late enough to demonstrate proper hospitality, but early enough to leave guests feeling satisfied rather than exhausted by the experience. The reunification of the two groups occurred with the same ceremonial precision that had marked the earlier separation. The Queen and her female guests returned to the main drawing room just as the men emerged from the library, their port glasses empty and their cigars reduced to ash. Secretary Harrison approached the Queen for the evening's final formal exchange.
"Your Majesty, this has been an extraordinary evening.
The hospitality you've shown us will not be forgotten, and I look forward to continuing our discussions through more conventional diplomatic channels." "The pleasure has been entirely mine, Mr. Secretary," the Queen replied. "I hope you'll consider this the beginning of a productive relationship between our governments."
Catherine noted with satisfaction that both leaders had managed to conclude the evening on a note that was both personal and professional.
The careful balance of formality and warmth that had characterized the entire dinner had succeeded in creating exactly the kind of diplomatic atmosphere that both countries had hoped to achieve. As the American delegation prepared to depart, Catherine began the process of documenting the evening's events for the official record. Every detail would be recorded, from Secretary Harrison's enthusiastic response to the traditional British cuisine to Mrs. Harrison's thoughtful questions about royal protocol. This information would be analyzed by diplomatic experts and used to shape future interactions between the two countries. The cars arrived precisely on schedule, and the American guests made their farewells with genuine warmth and appreciation. Catherine watched from the castle entrance as their convoy departed into the night, carrying with it the subtle but significant diplomatic progress that had been achieved through the ancient art of royal dining. The morning after the state dinner dawned crisp and clear over Windsor Castle. Catherine arrived at her office to find her desk covered with reports, photographs, and analysis documents from the previous evening's event. Protocol officers from the Foreign Office had already begun their detailed review of every moment, every gesture, and every word that had been exchanged during the dinner. She poured herself tea from the china service that had belonged to Queen Victoria and settled into her chair to begin the post-event analysis. This process was perhaps even more important than the dinner itself, because it would determine how the evening's achievements would be translated into concrete diplomatic progress in the weeks and months to come. The photographer's images told the story of a successful evening from multiple angles. Secretary Harrison's relaxed posture during the main course indicated that he had felt comfortable and welcome throughout the meal. Mrs. Harrison's genuine smile as she sampled the spotted dick showed that she had embraced the cultural experience rather than simply enduring it. Most importantly, the final group photograph captured an atmosphere of mutual respect and genuine friendship between the American delegation and their royal hosts. Catherine's phone buzzed with a call from the American Embassy. Cultural attaché Michael Brennan was calling to express the delegation's gratitude and to discuss follow-up arrangements for future diplomatic exchanges. "Catherine, I wanted to thank you personally for the extraordinary care that went into last evening's arrangements," Brennan said. "Secretary Harrison hasn't stopped talking about the experience. He's already asking when he might be able to host the Queen for a reciprocal dinner in Washington." This was exactly the kind of response that Catherine had hoped to hear. When foreign dignitaries left royal dinners eager to continue the relationship, it indicated that the careful choreography of royal hospitality had achieved its intended purpose. The combination of formal protocol and genuine warmth had created an emotional connection that would influence political relationships for years to come. "We were delighted to welcome the Secretary and his delegation," Catherine replied. Her Majesty was particularly impressed with their appreciation for British traditions and their willingness to engage with our customs. What she didn't mention was the detailed analysis that was already underway regarding Secretary Harrison's performance during the dinner. Protocol experts had noted his correct use of cutlery, his appropriate conversation topics, and his respectful treatment of palace staff. More importantly, they had observed his genuine curiosity about British culture and his willingness to ask thoughtful questions about royal traditions. The Queen herself had already provided her assessment of the evening to her private secretary. Her comments would become part of the official record and would influence how Britain approached future dealings with the American administration. Catherine had been told that Her Majesty's evaluation was overwhelmingly positive, with particular praise for the Secretary's diplomatic skills and his wife's gracious adaptation to royal protocol. In Washington, Secretary Harrison was conducting his own post-dinner briefings with State Department officials. The intelligence gathered during the evening's conversations would be incorporated into American diplomatic strategy, while the personal connections established with members of the royal family would provide valuable channels for future communication. "The Queen is remarkably well informed about American domestic politics," Harrison reported to his senior staff. "Her questions about agricultural policy weren't just polite conversation, she clearly understands the economic and political implications of farming legislation for rural American communities." This observation reflected one of the most important aspects of royal dining that outsiders rarely understood. The Queen's decades of experience hosting world leaders had taught her how to gather valuable intelligence through seemingly casual dinner conversation. Her questions about American agriculture had revealed important information about the current administration's priorities and political challenges. Meanwhile, Professor Chamberlain was analyzing video footage from the dinner for his academic research. The evening had provided numerous examples of the sophisticated communication systems that operated during royal dining events. He was particularly interested in documenting the subtle signals that had passed between the Queen and her staff throughout the meal. "Look at this moment during the fish course," he explained to his research assistant Sarah Mills. "The Queen adjusts her bracelet when Secretary Harrison makes his comment about sustainable farming. That's a signal to the staff that this topic should be remembered and possibly explored in future conversations." Sarah paused the video to study the gesture more carefully. "How do you distinguish between meaningful signals and random movements? Surely she can't be communicating intentionally with every adjustment of her jewelry or clothing." "That's the brilliance of the system," Professor Chamberlain replied. "Most gestures are indeed random, which provides perfect cover for the ones that carry actual meaning. Only the most experienced staff members can distinguish between coincidental movements and deliberate signals." This was one of the most fascinating aspects of royal protocol that Catherine had learned during her training. The communication system that operated during formal dinners was so subtle that even many palace employees weren't aware of its full complexity. Only the most senior staff members understood all the signals, and even they sometimes had to observe patterns over multiple events to confirm their interpretations. The afternoon brought meetings with various department heads who had been involved in the dinner's preparation. Chef Morrison reported that the American guests had eaten everything on their plates, a sign of both appreciation and good diplomatic manners. The wine steward noted that Secretary Harrison had complimented the port selection specifically, asking about the vintage and showing genuine interest in British winemaking traditions. Each of these details would be recorded in the official event file, contributing to a comprehensive picture of the evening's success. Future dinners for American delegations would be planned based on this information, with particular attention paid to elements that had been especially well received. Catherine's final task of the day was to prepare a summary report for the Queen's private secretary. This document would distill the evening's most important outcomes and provide recommendations for future diplomatic entertainment. She wrote carefully about Secretary Harrison's demonstrated respect for British traditions, his wife's successful adaptation to royal protocol, and the genuine warmth that had characterized interactions throughout the evening. But she also noted areas where future American guests might benefit from additional preparation. While the delegation had performed admirably overall, there had been moments of uncertainty about proper etiquette that could be avoided with more detailed pre-arrival briefings. Catherine recommended that future American visitors be provided with specific guidance about topics such as appropriate conversation subjects for different courses and proper responses to traditional British toasts. As evening approached, Catherine reflected on the remarkable transformation she had witnessed over the past 24 hours. Yesterday morning, Secretary Harrison had been a foreign dignitary whose political positions were well known but whose personal character remained largely unknown to the royal household. By the end of dinner, he had become a respected friend whose future visits would be anticipated with genuine pleasure rather than diplomatic obligation.
This transformation was the ultimate goal of royal dining protocol.
The elaborate rules and careful ceremonies weren't ends in themselves, but rather tools for creating the personal connections that made international diplomacy more effective and more humane. When political leaders genuinely liked and respected each other as individuals, they found ways to resolve conflicts and build cooperation even when their country's interests seemed to diverge.
The success of the evening would ripple outward in ways that might not become apparent for months or even years. Trade negotiations would proceed more smoothly because the negotiators knew their leaders had established personal rapport. Cultural exchanges would be approved more readily because both sides understood the value placed on mutual understanding.
Military cooperation would deepen because trust had been established at the highest levels of both governments. Catherine locked her office and prepared to leave Windsor Castle as the sun set over the ancient walls. Tomorrow would bring preparations for the next state dinner, a visit from the Australian Prime Minister that would require its own careful choreography and diplomatic considerations. But tonight, she could take satisfaction in knowing that an evening of carefully orchestrated hospitality had strengthened the bonds between two nations that had been allies for over 2 centuries. Walking through the castle's corridors, she passed the dining room where last night's dinner had taken place. The room had been restored to its usual immaculate condition, with no trace remaining of the evening's events except for the lingering sense of diplomatic achievement that seemed to permeate the very walls. The hidden language of royal table manners had spoken eloquently once again, conveying messages of respect, friendship, and mutual understanding that no formal treaty could capture. In a world increasingly dominated by digital communication and virtual meetings, the ancient art of sharing a meal remained one of the most powerful tools for building the personal relationships that made international cooperation possible. As Catherine drove through the castle gates toward her home in the village, she reflected on the privilege of serving as a guardian of traditions that had shaped the course of history itself. Tomorrow, the work would begin again, but tonight, the satisfaction of a diplomatic mission accomplished would sustain her through the challenges that lay ahead.